Yes, thank you. We're very excited to be pulling our own weight at this conference, which has been so lovely to attend so far. And I just want to make a brief plug for the program that Trish and I co-coordinate, which is Georgetown, Qatar's program in energy humanities. If you'd like to hear anything else about that, please come and find us at some point. But in the meantime, I'm really excited to be introducing you to the second panel of the day and to be introducing our first speaker, who is Hatib Kader, who is a postdoctoral researcher in global studies at Aarhus University in Denmark, and who will be starting a new position at the Royal Netherlands Institute of Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies starting in January 2025. His paper is entitled, which he co-authored with Anna Singh, is entitled Fish That Empty the Water, Co-Species Invasion at the Eastern End of the Indian Ocean. So please join me in welcoming Hatib.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. This paper that I will present today is a work on together with Professor Anna Singh. So we have two versions of the paper, and the one that I'm going to present is the oral versions, and then we are working on the second version, on the written version. And then also Professor Anna Singh do apologize because it's still 3 p.m. in the morning in California. So he hope he will join after this presentation when it's 7 a.m. over there. So, okay, I will do my presentations here. Fish that empty the water, co-species invasion at the eastern end of the Indian Oceans. So these are the paper that we are working together. I'm working together with Anna, and this is the oral version, and then there's going to be another version with the written one. So on October 14, 2023, the governor of Southwest Papua used mangrove conservation ceremony as the occasion to release 1,000 Nile tilapia fry into the tidal water for the cause of food security. Tilapia are not fond of brackish swamps, but this one seemed to have the get adult quickly into drains and streams. By the time the tide went out a few hours later, not a single fish fry could be seen. And while we will come back to the aptitudes of the fish, the important point of this anecdote here is the use of an introduced species that coming from Indian Ocean water, including the Africa, that everyone knows tends to be invasive in Indonesia and also destructive of local ecosystem to combat an imagined lack of food in West Papua. So the question is that, are indigenous fish not good enough, and who gave the governor permission to mess with indigenous ecologies? So here you can see the introduction of freshwater fish to West Papua from Indonesian government is closely tied to Indonesian military in 1963. Indonesian army landed in Sorong in our research in West Papua. You can see in the map and concentrate the more indigenous Papuan in several areas. And then the Indonesian military assumed that Papuans, the West Papua, living inland lack sufficient fish stocks. As a result, Indonesian military began introducing freshwater fish into the ponds. So one notable figure of this time was Mr. Adidan, an Indonesian army officer who established snakehead fish in the kampung in Sorong. So military bureaucrats and university-based technocratic scientists predominantly supported by military introduced all of the introduced fish from Java. If you see here there is a city Surabaya, that's from this island. So basically the fish not only from this, but also introduced from the Indian Ocean, also from the uh, uh, African mainland. So these are species focus that we do the research is snakehead fish and then catfish, Mozambique tilapia and Nile tilapia. This species has become viral in West Papua landscape and waterscapes. So between 1970 and 2000, part of the transmigration programs, around 300,000 settlers farmers were relocated to West Papua from other islands in Dance Island in Indonesia. So they bring them together a variety of freshwater fish species, cattle, and horticulture crops. So these fish are basically also coming from the Indian Ocean water and also from the river in mainland Africa. So they move from Java Island here to the West Papua. So here is the town that we do the research. So before the arrival of Indonesian army, the Dutch has introduced basically snakehead fish around this oil compound in the mid 1950s, and then the reason is that to enhance the nutrition of the employees and also enhance the nutrition of the indigenous people. So before that, so here you can see the Dutch introduced first. So let's let's start from the snakehead fish as the most difficult fish to domesticate. So compared to other fish like Nile tilapia and also Mozambique tilapia that we will discuss, snakehead fish is the first freshwater species introduced in West Papua and the most difficult to domesticate. Those who have cultivated many introduced species explain that these are the apex predator among the introduced species, the most difficult to domesticate. For example, one of our interlocutor, a Papuan who farms Nile tilapia, attempt to domesticate snakehead fish. He note they're all gone. I don't know where they jump out. Others make holes and go through the canals and ditches. And then one of the fish farmer also showing a pocket that mimic the fish downward swimming motion when caught. So it's not easy to domesticate snakehead fish because they kind of like downward through the mud. And then the second fish is that catfish. This is the most professionally farmed fish. Settler often felt that to elevate catfish reputation, given catfish association in Metropole Java, living in septic tanks and eating human waste. But when it turns to West Papua, the catfish become professionally cultivated on the pond and then also given. So you can see here, catfish are professional farmed to improve their taste. The juvenile catfish are fed with a mix of powder milk and half-boiled eggs. And then one of our interlocutor asked me to buy powder milk sachet to pour into the cement pond after spotting red worms in the canals used to feed the juvenile catfish. So it's very professional how the introduced species fish when it turns to West Papua. And then, but the thing is that from biological expert report that catfish are air-breathing fish, and from our anthropological observation, we provided vivid demonstration where the fish operator we watch as he selected catfish broodstock for breeding. He drained the cement tanks, and the catfish broodstock can survive for hours without water. That's the reason why he is an air-breathing fish. And catfish have ability to jump over the ponds and even walk more than 50 meters to the nearest ditch or canal. That's why it's very invasive. So our interlocutor Mulyono also saw us thousands of catfish fry from the latest breeding cycle, and then he meticulously separated the failed eggs from the thousand of the successful one, and then a process repeated every 3 months. So thousands of catfish fry from the latest breeding cycle. So this is the latest breeding cycle. So you can see how 1,000 of these catfish. And then these are also feral fish before Nile tilapia was introduced in West Papua. Nile tilapia was quite recent to be introduced in West Papua in 2008, together with the Indonesian government that argued that West Papua, as a colonized island, has a lack of food from their settler colonies perspective. Fish that one of our interlocutor found, Anton, before was betik or anabas, and then gete-gete that was introduced. And then here is the Nile tilapia ponds. And then the Nile tilapia have become feral as they escaped during the floods. Several of our interlocutor, two fish farmers, shared their experience of high flood water following heavy rain. And then it's allowed the fish, especially in the pond, like Nile tilapia, catfish, to be escaped from the pond and become very invasive in the ditch and urban canals. So here is the Nile tilapia. So one of our interlocutor prevent the frustrating flood. He had installed a hose to pump out flood water, which worsened after two large hotels suspected of inadequate drainage redirected water into his pond and the surrounding area. So during our visit, he showed us fishing, swimming around his house, and he also told us that Nile tilapia there are 33 variety of Nile tilapia in West Papua. And then, so the Nile tilapia escaped from the pond and inhabited areas filled with sewage, leftover soap, old tires, abandoned boats, and plastic waste. Despite this pollution, they thrive in ditch and canals, and they can survive from the plant and algae that provide dissolved oxygens. So all of these invasive introduced that turning to be invasive water can survive in the human disturbance and degraded environment. So in other words, here we see that human or urban infrastructure also produce or facilitate the invasive fish species that encounter with this infrastructure. So we also find that under dens of water hyacinth, we discovered varieties of freshwater species, genus, and varieties of betik. So you can see when the fish escape from the pond, the invasive species, and then they live together with the water hyacinth, proliferate rapidly, especially in the artificial river or kali buatan flows during the seasons. And then when the dry periods occur, stagnant water leaves behind clay and sediment from upstream sand mining, creating a challenging yet vibrant ecosystem for this invasive species fish. So they can still live in this kind of degraded environment. And then Nile tilapia, Mozambique tilapia, snakehead fish, and also catfish can live in the escape from the pond. And then they not only migrate to ditch and artificial rivers, but also inhabit abandoned housing foundation that have settled in swampy areas. So our research location is basically in the swampy areas that try to be concretized with cement and pond, but it's always failed because the swamp areas will leak. And then during these floods, this foundation collect water, like you see in the picture, effectively creating small ponds where all of these invasive Nile tilapia, Mozambique tilapia thrive and live and adapt in this kind of landscape, that ability to live. So here that Anasing and I, we did a research, we took a photo in 2002, you see on the left, where there's still a pond, water is floating there. But then when urban infrastructure block the water flow, the brackish water, and then it grows the water hyacinth and water lettuce growing up on the water and suck the water. But what we can see is that all of these invasive species still can thrive under the water hyacinth and the water lettuce. So we take the photo in August in 2002, and then 2 years later we took the photo, and then you can see how rapid and fast the landscape changing. And then here is the fish that escape from the pond and live on the degraded environment, including snakehead fish and also Nile tilapia. Here are also another example of how a photo that we took in August 2000 and different. You can see on the left, it used to be a brackish water. There is a still flowing brackish water, and then urban infrastructure blocked the brackish water, and then it's created a water hyacinth on the left. You can see here is the water lettuce, and then we pull up the water lettuce, and this water lettuce can thrive together, live with the invasive species. So with invasive water lettuce covering vast area, so one of the fish angler that we met focused on the remaining swamp before they too become overrun. He jumped over dikes and waded through the water up to his waist to reach his fishing location. His name is Anton. And then he said it takes more effort now since many swampy water catchment have shrunk, forcing fishers to venture further into the remaining ponds. So you can see here urban infrastructure block the brackish water, and then you can see the kind of like mix between grass and the rest of mangrove area. So here are the picture of the vanishing of endemic fish that couldn't compete and survive against the introduced that turning to be invasive species fish. These are the vanishing of Papuan endemic fish is sorong rainbow fish, or the more indigenous called as moi or as cassingless. They also died because of the oil palms in Sorong was introduced. And then another reasons why endemic fish vanished and died was because the pollution and murkiness from logging and sand mining have rendered Sorong's river inhospitable, and then reducing the visibility for endemic fish to spot prey, and then ultimately resulting starvation and death. And then you can see the picture on Anasing and I walking in the one in the branch of water, and then you can see on the left, one river was murky and polluted from sand mining, while the other was a clear stream where rainbow fish reportedly found. But however, Anasing and I, we only spotted water fish or beta palfina. This is another kind of like invasive species fish. It's quite difficult to find the endemic fish species anymore. These are another factors why endemic fish couldn't thrive, couldn't survive. Endemic fish population have declined due to use of insecticide. Settler fishers often employ chemicals like this, thiodan and akodan, to poison rivers. This insecticide is basically banned in the US and in India, but are still widely available in West Papua. But the introduced turned to be invasive species still can survive because of their numbers. So these are another endemic shrimp that vanish and extinct endemic freshwater fish shrimp in Warsamson River. And then this another in the end of our field work, and then Anasin went to the periphery of Sorong, and she found the endemic fish. It's called Milo fish, which appears more colorful than Nile tilapia. You can see here. So you can only find the endemic fish species in the periphery, not in the urban area where settlers and all of the invasive species have occupied the locations. So these are also what is that? Another invasive species that we found. It's called wader in endemic in their metropole. They're endemic but becomes invasive in the rivers around Sorong in West Papua. So what we found is that the rest of fish that is endemic could be endemic, for example, in Indian Ocean water or in Africa mainland, in the river of Africa. But when it is migrate and become co-invasive with the human population and human migration and human settlers, and then it becomes very invasive in other mainland. So the rapid transformation of landscape from swamp to concrete, in our case, has not only facilitated the invasion of introduced fish, but also allowed various invasive species to thrive, including water hyacinth, water lettuce, and sword grass, as you see in the pictures. In West Papua, the context of the rationale of deploying introduced species often relates to racial assumptions that the colonized land, the Papuan, lacks sufficient resources to support settlers' necessity. This belief, rooted in the concept of terra nullius, that frames Papuan land as empty to justify the introduce of non-native species, whether Nile tilapia, Mozambique tilapia, to fill the land that is perceived as a void land or terra nullius. This kind of terra nullius perspective underscores a mindset of racial superiority held by Indonesian government, both agriculture and fisheries, expert and settler colonies over indigenous Papuan and their non-human counterparts. So Indonesian government assumed by using, in other words, Anna Singh also argues in our paper that Indonesian governments using the word of food security, where fish become the co-species of the food security, Indonesian food security, to fill the lack of food nutrition in West Papua by assuming that West Papua is terra nullius or empty land, by assuming that the land is empty and then it needs to be filled with food nutrition or food security. But as I presented here on behalf of Anna Singh, also we can see that the reason of food security end up with the kind of invasive species that fill and live and thrive and survive in the kind of degraded environment in urban Sorong in West Papua. Thank you. That's all I got. I return it to moderator.
All right, thank you so much. So now we'll move on to the second presentation. It's by Philip Gooding, the project manager and former postdoctoral researcher at the Indian Ocean World Center at McGill University in Canada. Philip's presentation will be titled Elephants, Agriculture and Ecological Change in Unyamwezi, West Central Tanzania, 1850s to 1910s.
All right, thank you very much. Firstly, I want to thank the organisers for accommodating me and to apologise again for not being able to be there. Some things just out of our control. I very much wish that I was with you all in Sharjah right now. In any case, this paper takes a multi-species approach to investigate changing ecological conditions in Unyamwezi, a region in present-day West Central Tanzania. And it focuses on the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Unyamwezi broadly corresponds to present-day Tabora region in Tanzania. In the 19th century, it is a permeable space with ill-defined boundaries, and it comprised several independent chiefdoms. Some parts of the region underwent a period of centralization during the 19th century that was partly driven by political leaders' ability to control and direct the sources and trade of elephant ivory within their domains. The most prominent of those are marked on this map. They were Unyanyembe, which was centered on Tabora in central Unyamwezi, Mirimbos, centered on Urumbo in western Unyamwezi, and Simbas, centered on Usavira in Ukonongo, which is in southwestern part of what can be considered Greater Unyamwezi. The peoples of Unyamwezi, referred to as Unyamwezi, famous outside the region as traders and porters, notably by carrying ivory from inland regions to the coast for export into the wider global economy. The paper is inspired by two strands of scholarship focused on elephants. The first of these is situated in environmental history and is largely focused on Asian elephants. The formative work in this context is Mark Elvin's Retreat of the Elephants, in which the author convincingly argued that the gradual extinction of elephants over the course of 3,000 years in almost all Chinese regions can be attributed largely to humans destroying elephant habitats for the purposes of agricultural expansion. This perspective has been supported more recently by Thomas R. Troutman's Elephants and Kings, in which the author argued that elephants' persistence in other Asian regions can partly be attributed to political leaders protecting elephant habitats, as live elephants were required in war. This growing scholarly canon points to the importance of situating environmental histories of elephants within wider frames of human-environment interaction. The second strand of scholarship that inspires this paper comes from the natural sciences. Specifically, it refers to recent scholarship on African savanna elephants, which stresses the importance of elephants themselves as agents of environmental change. Scholars in this field have observed that large elephant populations contribute to the depletion of woodland areas through tree felling, debarking, and nutrition, and that, by contrast, rapid retreats of elephants can contribute to woodland recovery. For example, increased density of elephant populations in parts of the Amboseli Basin of present-day southern Kenya over the last 50 years has contributed to the transformation of woodland into grasslands and shrublands. On the other hand, unrestrained poaching in western Uganda's Queen Elizabeth National Park during the 1970s contributed to the expansion of woodland and thickets. This scholarship, which includes extensive investigations in southern as well as eastern Africa, points to the importance of a multi-species approach to understanding environmental and ecological change. Collectively, the two strands of scholarship that inspired this paper point to the possibility of thinking about long-term ecological changes through a human-elephant nexus. This approach is especially important for this regional and temporal case study. During the second half of the 19th century, somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 elephants were killed annually in Eastern Africa to supply the global ivory trade, with most entering the Indian Ocean world and the wider global economy through Zanzibar. This resulted in the depletion of elephant populations across vast swathes of the region, including in Unyamwezi. In this context, historical ecologists have postulated that the near extinction of elephants in Unyamwezi during the 19th century may have contributed to major changes in the region's ecologies. Specifically, they refer to a few early imperial documentary sources that point to a process of woodland recovery over time, which might be attributable to the gradual extermination of elephants to feed the ivory trade. Moreover, this woodland recovery may have contributed to an increased density of tsetse flies, which carry sleeping sickness, which is a disease fatal to cattle. The implications of this research, therefore, are that hunting elephants to feed the ivory trade may have set in motion a series of ecological changes that gradually undermined the agro-pastoral lifeways that dominated the region's productive base during the late 19th century. One of this paper's contributions is to put this hypothesis to the test. First, it's going to discuss when and where elephants were hunted or pushed out of existence in Unyamwezi. And then second, it will use this discussion alongside an analysis of changing agricultural conditions to examine the factors that contributed to ecological change, focusing principally on western Unyamwezi around Mirambo's domain. The issue of when and where elephants were hunted in Eastern Africa during the 19th century is a matter of some controversy. Until recently, historians ascribed to the concept of the ivory frontier. This hypothesis suggested that overhunting elephants, which historians argue contributed to regional elephant extinctions, was the major driver of the expansion of commercial networks from the Indian Ocean coast towards the west, that is, into regions where elephants were still in abundance. So the core argument was elephant extinctions forced ivory traders to move further and further and further away from the coast to bring elephant ivory back to the Indian Ocean. But interdisciplinary analyses have recently shown this to be an oversimplification. Elephants continued to inhabit regions close to the coast, and ivory was sourced from diverse regions across inland Eastern Africa throughout the 19th century. Indeed, the ivory frontier hypothesis echoes colonialist paradigms that sought to justify European rule. Colonial-era Europeans built racialized tropes about Africans' inabilities to care for their environments and Muslim-Arab exploitation of African peoples and resources. Descriptions of elephant extinctions as a driver of westward commercial expansion, therefore, served to demonize existing economic and environmental relations to European administrators and publics, which to them justified their intervention. More recent historical analysis, by contrast, has argued that instead of regional elephant extinctions, westward expansion was probably driven by favorable commercial and political conditions in the eastern Congo rainforests, within which coastal traders established centers in the late 1860s. Evidence from Unyamwezi supports this more recent assessment. Several German accounts state that there are abundant elephants in Unyanyembe in central Unyamwezi until the mid-19th century, before coastal traders and their associates wiped them out. And by coastal traders, I refer to who colonial rulers referred to as, used broadly under the moniker Arabs. But the evidence for this chronology is far from conclusive. Indeed, human activities had probably pushed elephants to the margins of central Unyamwezi before the existence of an established coastal trader settlement. To be clear, hunting by Nyamwezi hunters that helped to facilitate the early ivory trade may have been a factor here, but agricultural expansion since the early 19th century was probably more crucial. In the late 1850s, early imperialist Richard Burton described Unyanyembe as, quote, a well-hoed field, end quote, that produced sorghum, maize, and rice. This contrasted with the forested region to the east, through which he had just travelled, and his characterization of trade routes across Unyamwezi as passing through, quote, thick thorn jungle and thin forests of trees, end quote. It was probably to these kinds of regions that Burton was referring when he stated that elephants and other megafauna were numerous in Unyamwezi in the late 1850s. Deforestation for the purposes of agriculture probably destroyed elephant habitats in Unyanyembe, pushing them elsewhere before the mid-19th century. Support for this assessment comes from direct evidence of agriculture's effects on elephant populations in a nearby region. In the late 1850s, Burton described a forested region known as the Umgunda Umkali, just to the east of Unyamwezi, as, quote, elephant ground, that was filled with numerous pitfalls to trap elephants. But by the early 1870s, much of the region had been transformed. Verney Lovett Cameron wrote, quote, water has been found in many places. Large spaces have been cleared and brought under cultivation, and, under the dominion of man, some of the most fertile spots in Africa are now scattered in the midst of what was formerly forest, end quote. Elephants, their prints, and pitfalls to trap them were then only visible in smaller forested tracts on the eastern edge of Unyamwezi, around Tura, Ikungu. Indeed, elephants continued to inhabit this locale well into the colonial period, and became prime hunting ground for the few remaining specialized Nyamwezi elephant hunters in the 1890s. Their activities were eventually halted by the restrictive policies of the German colonial government through bans on hunting without a license that they enforced from their military base in Tabora. Nyamwezi hunters could not afford these licenses, and the Europeans who could neglected this locale as apparently the forested and swampy terrain was too difficult for them to navigate comfortably. A smaller human imprint on the elephant's natural habitat may have protected this group of elephants from destruction into the early 20th century. Elephants also thrived long after the westward expansion of commercial routes in southwestern Unyamwezi, including in Ukonongo near Usavira. As late as 1877, Bukanongo was known for having, quote, no traffic at all with the coast, end quote. This was despite its proximity to Tabora and its abundant populations of elephants. Again, dense forests and swamps may have contributed to this region being neglected by hunters and traders, at least initially, even though large caravans were known to pass through occasionally, at least from the 1860s. In any case, this situation soon changed. Simba, the most prominent chieftain in the region, sought to benefit from increased participation in the ivory trade. To this end, he welcomed the establishment of a coastal trader called Matamula, with a retinue of around 300 gun and spear-wielding elephant hunters into his domain, using his capital at Usavira as a base. Simba's success soon brought him into competition with Mirambo, whose influence and reliance on controlling the sources and trade of ivory in his domain had probably wiped elephants out of western Unyamwezi by some point in the late 1860s or 1870s. In 1881, Mirambo's forces overran Simba's capital and he co-opted Matamula as his ally. Together, they decimated southwestern Unyamwezi. Violent conflict played out throughout the mid-1880s, making the region almost impassable for people traveling between Tabora and central Lake Tanganyika. Meanwhile, elephants were practically wiped out. Coastal traders inhabiting Kirando, a town on Lake Tanganyika's southeastern shores, were forced to hunt on the other side of the lake. Matamula entered the Bemba region, to the south of Lake Tanganyika in the late 1880s, to hunt for alternative supplies. By the 1890s, the presence of elephants between southwestern Unyamwezi and the region around Lake Rukwa, was just a memory of a bygone era. Therefore, several factors contributed to the changing location and numbers of elephants in 19th century Unyamwezi. Habitat destruction through deforestation for agricultural purposes probably pushed elephants into the margins of locales that they'd previously inhabited from the early 19th century. This was particularly true in Unyanyembe. They were then overhunted from more concentrated forested locations thereafter, including in western and southwestern Unyamwezi, in and around Mirambo's and Simba's respective domains. These patterns, of course, do not correspond to older characterizations of an ivory frontier. Ecological and demographic factors contributed to the uneven decimation of elephant populations over time and space. Indeed, these factors probably helped some elephant populations to survive into the early 20th century, notably in eastern Unyamwezi. It is for this reason that any analysis of ecological change following the decimation of elephant populations in Unyamwezi must account for significant sub-regional variation. Now, for the purposes of brevity, I'm just going to focus on one area of Unyamwezi here, the western region within Mirambo's domain. This region experienced a decimation of its elephant population during the 19th century, but it is crucial to note that it also experienced a major shift in human-environment interaction. In the late 1850s, the largest settlement in the region was recorded as containing only around 160 domiciles. But by the early 1880s, Mirambo's capital, that is Urambo, had a population of around 20,000 and is surrounded by cultivated fields. It was located in prime cultivable land, and exploitation of this natural resource for food production was essential for the maintenance of the state until its violent collapse in 1884 to 1885. In the 1850s, Burton referred to the region between Unyanyembe and what later became Urambo as a mixture of, quote, thick green jungle, fertile rolling plains, and thin wood and field studded with granite rocks. Settlements were situated in clearings within these wider landscapes. These regions were bordered by, quote, low wooded and stony hills, end quote. Similarly, west of Urambo, Burton reported that, quote, the vegetation was excessive, end quote, and that where there was no cultivation, a dense matting of coarse grass veiled the earth. The thick jungle, thinly wooded areas, and grasslands in western Unyamwezi were probably the haunts of elephants, according to Burton's and his contemporaries' descriptions, which stated that elephants were numerous in Unyamwezi as a whole. Such elephants occasionally encountered small human settlements, eating crops, digging up fields, and destroying structures as they did so. But as a general rule, their presence may have contributed to a minimizing of woodland and overgrown bush. Descriptions of western Unyamwezi were significantly different in the late 1870s and early 1880s, compared to 2 to 3 decades previously. They point to a mixture of deforestation, the purpose of expanding the cultivated area, abandoned settlements owing to destruction during the wars associated with Mirambo's expansion, and early signs of woodland recovery in those destroyed zones. After travelling through a small tract of forest between Unyanyembe and Mirambo's domain, Arthur Dodgson of the London Missionary Society reported in 1879 that, quote, almost the whole way to Urimbo had been cultivated, end quote, and then abandoned in favour of larger protected settlements due to hostilities. In the rainy season, this left ridges and hollows that filled with water, making travel difficult. Such statements are supported by those of his compatriots, such as William Griffith, who indicated in the same year that, quote, once cultivated districts are now overrun with forests of a few years, end quote. Similarly, Alfred John Wookey in 1880 reported that he passed, quote, deserted villages and old cornfields now overgrown with trees and bush, end quote. That such regions had only recently been cultivated is attested to by evidence of trees having only recently been cut down. Both Griffith and earlier in the 1870s, Cameron described this phenomenon. Demands for produce in emergent population centres, such as Urimbo, necessitated expansion of the cultivated area, which violence subsequently undermined. Urimbo then supplemented harvest shortfalls within and close to his domain through tributary payments from further afield. These environmental shifts point to two developments in the human-elephant relationship. First, the expansion of the cultivated area and associated deforestation destroyed elephant habitats, much as it had earlier in the century in Unyanyembe. This, coupled with overhunting, decimated Western Unyamwezi's elephant populations. Indeed, none of the missionaries cited above hinted at the existence of elephants in Unyamwezi, contrary to Burton's reports in the late 1850s. Second, absence of elephants in the region may have accelerated the rate at which they became overgrown. Both Griffith and Wookey alluded to the beginnings of this process, but the situation became much more pervasive in subsequent years. During the late 1880s, by which time Urimbo state had collapsed amid violence and famine, members of the White Fathers in the vicinity of Urimbo reported seeing, quote, vast plains, tall grasses and jungles with no signs of cultivation or inhabitants, end quote. German colonial sources then indicated that some such locales, including in Western Unyamwezi, quote, soon turned into young forest, end quote. Woodland recovery of this nature was most successful in locales of higher elevation, as young trees were less likely to become submerged during the rainy season. Lower areas remained overgrown with bush. A combination of elephant hunting and abandonment of agriculture in certain locales facilitated the revitalization of woodland in Western Unyamwezi in the 1890s. That Western and other parts of Unyamwezi remained, quote, overgrown with bush and forest, end quote, throughout the German period, however, cannot solely be attributed to the absence of elephants. The rinderpest epizootic of the early 1890s was particularly devastating in Unyamwezi, which undermined agropastoralist designs and recultivating previously cultivated land. Meanwhile, the German colonial government, which was established in the region from around 1892, in imposing taxes, forced Unyamwezi populations to find sources of cash, which is principally available through wage labour. In so doing, they built on a pre-existing migrant labour culture that had hitherto been expressed primarily in long-distance porterage. But in providing opportunities for plantation work at the coast and in railway construction on the central line between the Indian Ocean coast and Lake Tanganyika, they took working-aged men out of the agricultural labour force for longer than in previous years. This process contributed further to the expansion of bush at the expense of cultivated land. Indeed, these patterns were especially strong in Unyamwezi. Tax collection was enforced more rigorously here than in more remote regions due to the presence of the military posts in Tabora. Therefore, colonial labour and tax policies were a key driver of woodland recovery in Western Unyamwezi in the early 20th century. They limited Unyamwezi farmers' capacities to manage their environments as they had done so before the violent expansion and subsequent collapse of Urimbo state. In concluding, the point to make here is that there are multiple factors that contributed to woodland recovery in late 19th century and late 19th and early 20th century Unyamwezi. This paper's core findings, which in the written up version are supported with reference to other frames of human-elephant interaction and with reference to other parts of Unyamwezi, contravene expectations that might be garnered from analysis of recent research in the natural sciences that link the depletion or growth of elephant populations with woodland recovery or deterioration. Instead, it attributes the fates of woodlands in Unyamwezi during the 19th and early 20th centuries more to the presence, absence, expansion, and abandonment of agriculture. The growth of political and commercial centres, such as Tabora and Urambo, necessitated an expansion of the cultivated area, which itself necessitated the cutting down of forest and the management of bush. When violence, famine, emigration, and colonial taxation caused the abandonment of farms, the latter became overgrown, leading to woodland recovery. The absence of elephants in Unyamwezi from the mid-1880s may have accelerated this process, but its effects on its own are difficult to quantify. These conclusions mean that this paper's overall thread has more in common with environmental histories of elephant extinctions in Asia than with recent natural science research focused on Eastern and Southern Africa. The core reason to which I attribute the discrepancy between this paper's findings and that which has been recently published in the natural sciences relates to the human imprint. Natural scientists assessing the relationships between elephants and ecological change have focused on regions where there are not large human populations. They've analysed relatively small, protected areas in which populations of elephants have become increasingly concentrated over the last several decades. In these contexts, elephants have rightly been understood as among the biggest drivers of woodland depletion in their locale. Agriculture and other human factors that contribute to deforestation are absent from these case studies. Thus, extrapolating the findings and implications of this research to 19th and early 20th century Unyamwezi fails to account for the dynamic human environmental histories that covered a large area and which were taking place at the same time. Indeed, until recently, historians have neglected agricultural change as a major feature of state building and commercial change in 19th century Eastern Africa. This kind of research, which emphasizes the importance of African states and societies' efforts to mold their environments, is necessary to contextualize elephant environment and relationships in the 19th and early 20th centuries.
So I have two parts to my presentation, the last presentation of the day, I think. The first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the project itself. I'm just going to give like 4 minutes or so to that. And then I'm going to show you part of a film that we have produced as part of our team outputs for the South African Research Chair project in Ocean Cultures and Heritage. I'll begin, of course, by saying that I think up to this point, we are all pretty much aware of the fact that responses to climate change and the climate crisis is in fact a multi-dimensional prospect and endeavor. It's certainly not a process that is entirely linear. It is a profoundly political process. There are many political and power differentials that influence the extent to which humans can respond to the crisis. It's also difficult to calculate or measure, even though we now have many scientists that are in place in various parts of the world that tell us through modeling processes how we can achieve this. And from the ethnographic research, the anthropological research that is being done, it's also quite clear that there is a lot of information that we can glean from local communities in the Southwest Indian Ocean region and other parts of the Indian Ocean, as well as Southern Africa. And up to this point, I think the focus has very much been on policy directives, on meetings that take place at a global level, at which people who perhaps do not have contact with local communities are making decisions, I think, often for these communities. I'd also like to add 4 brief points before I open the PowerPoint, and that is that I think our inspiration for human responses, even, trans-species or multi-species responses to climate change should draw on the environment that we're all situated in. And sometimes that information comes to us either in verse. For example, one of the areas that I've been exploring quite recently in my own work is that of poetry, the responsiveness of the universe in verse. And I think here specifically of the poetry of David Whyte and Mary Oliver. David Whyte's poem, Everything is Waiting for You. The fact of even that which is supposedly insentient or inanimate, that also has a potential response, which often we're not looking at. So in terms of, if we think of the field research in Madagascar, there are many, many elements in that kind of context, especially in Antananarivo, where we're told that that which is inanimate has a particular, has these qualities that can respond to us, and that there are agencies there beyond the anthropomorphic that allow us to respond to that which is patently catastrophic. A second potential area of inspiration is, I think temporality itself, time, and you'll see this in the film that I'll show just now. And I drew inspiration specifically from the work of Borges, is particularly his idea of time as a continuous flowing river in which everything is subsumed and adds to sort of the layers of our experience. And so when we think of climate change and the climate crisis, the tendency, because I've worked quite extensively with marine scientists, the tendency is to point to the impacts, of change, of the climate change on the marine fauna and flora. And there isn't perhaps sufficient attention, I think, up to this point, on the accumulation of the many experiences that have actually taken place in a particular coastal context. And I think Borges and others actually encourages us to see the coastal environment in particular where I work as being a holistic space, a multi-layered space where there are many different temporal experiences. Okay, I'll give the other examples just now. Let's move on. Quick slides. So obviously my early, just to give you a sense of the work, so the research team has been doing field research, anthropological field research in Southern Africa and also parts of East Africa. Done quite a lot of South African field work, and then my own previous field work was in the Southwest Indian Ocean region. So I think for us we're perhaps more practical in that sense. We've collected a vast amount of field data, interviews, observations, of many different communities across these different locales to try and understand in particular how communities have been responding to socio-political challenges in particular, but also to the issue of change and climate change in their environment. The work is also profoundly intergenerational, so I'm not alone in this work. So we work with people that have use many different languages, whether it is Swahili, or Zulu or isiXhosa, which is common in South Africa, and we try as much as possible to adapt the interview process, or to place our interviewers into contexts where they are perhaps more fluent in a particular language. These are some of the publications, and I emphasize that the work has been quite interdisciplinary in the sense of we have the photographic books. We worked a lot with photographers and filmmakers to produce pieces like the two at the top, Coastal Worlds and Ocean Beings, that are actually, I would say, ethnography thin, but audio visually rich accounts of the experiences that people are having in the sort of coastal context. Coastal Worlds in particular covers the field work in Kenya, in Seychelles, Namibia, and South Africa. And Ocean Beings, it's a couple of more countries. And then, of course, there's the poetry output or anthology. The one in particular I think that may be of interest to people here is the one called Love a Brine, which looks at a sort of the transmaterial relationship between humans and the ocean, but through the lens of the sea. And the others are there, the older books. So this really is the interest. What is the role of the forest and the sea in resilience in the Seychelles? And you will see that this film, before I begin, that, as I said, it's based on anthropological fieldwork that we carried out in 2023, so last year. It's quite fresh. But it also, I think, represents some of the thinking of mine around sort of communities in Seychelles and resilience in Seychelles dating back to 2005 when I first did fieldwork there. And of course it forms part of a multi-country project. It's about intangible cultural heritage in the coastal context, and the fact that when we look at UNESCO's concept of World Heritage, it's really, I think, valuable because it seeks to understand what can constitute universally valuable heritage that can be elevated and presented for a global audience, but at the same time, it is limiting in the sense that it doesn't make, I think, sufficient space for the kinds of intangible cultural heritages that will never be identified by the national commissions of UNESCO for preservation on these World Heritage lists.
The Seychelles consists of an archipelago of 115 islands spread across the northeastern Indian Ocean region. In October 2023, my team and I conducted a series of interviews in the archipelago. We did field research in La Digue, Silhouette, Praslin, and Mai Islands. The islands have experienced a long history of colonization and globalization, and today they represent a melting pot of cultural practices and beliefs, as well as international tourism. Our research findings indicate that the Seychelles is also a rich repository of intangible cultural heritage, and that these provide the support for resilience against innumerable odds. This film on the Seychelles indicates how, in the Seychelles archipelago, local communities have psychologically and culturally responded to enduring traumatic circumstances, and how their responses can tell us what may be needed to adapt to the kind of change that is presented by a climate crisis. The response to the climate change challenge will require more than swift attention to a reduction in fossil fuel use and an increase in the use of renewable energy. People will have to adopt new psychosocial tools that will help them, cognitively and culturally, to adapt to an already changing climate and the potentially traumatic situations that these circumstances will bring.
What does it mean to lose the land of your birth, to lose your traditions, your cultural heritage, that which has been passed from one generation to the next, the things that your family enjoyed, the music, the food, the way of life? We are here on Silhouette Island, one of 115 islands of the Seychellois archipelago. It is a place of incredible beauty, but also a place of fascinating stories, which we'll share with you as we go along on this journey. So the other thing, sorry, I'm just going to forward there.
Which is situated deep in the mountains above the southern town of Takamaka. This is where the British colonial government had given land to those who returned from the Second World War. The individuals living there do not own the land, but have right of use. For the Seychellois, the forest therefore has garnered a positive association, even if we occasionally heard people speaking about those who live in the mountains in a negative way. A positive account of the forest emerged in the story of a woman who we called the Weaver Woman. She related an idyllic childhood on La Digue Island, as well as the role of memory as a device to respond to a traumatic present.
Comme si la digue tic gou 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 gou. Là mon sorti la digue mon venu ici. Mon mazine tous les jours, mon mazine ça oui ouais dans mon esprit. Mais à part ça, mon tiens mon terre pied du bois. Mon con nager. De l'eau salée, oui, mon con faire case. Mais t'as pas fait mon con faire. Mais dans la forêt, il y a mon algo de zèbre. Nous tiens en bœuf. Malgo de zèbre pour bœuf. Malheureux de go manger, pareil, mon papa il planté dans bois dans cesse manger, go manger maillot, patate, on descend avec le licou. Le licou amène d'agoni. Amène bien mon fort, amène ban bir plaqué là. Ben nous descendons avec après Zach puis yapin, la mène pour donner caution, donner animaux, pour nourrir les animaux. Mais tous les jours, on a fait l'aventure dans la forêt. Dans la forêt, tout ça, on a fait dans la forêt.
Ça veut dire que je peux manger, je peux manger.
Oui, peut manger, peut manger, peut présent, nous peut riger, nous peut faire face. Présent, nous, les nous arrivons là-bas, nous faisons capacha, nous mettons là-dedans, nous descendons avec.
An aspect of the colonial past included childhood labor on the copra plantation. This involved physical trauma via long hours of work, carrying massive loads of coconut and shelling them at a speed to make the daily quota for the plantation owners. One of the interviewees explained how children as young as 12 years old were forced to produce what are essentially adult work quotas. She added that her life changed for the better when she left the plantation and returned to a life of subsistence as a married adult. She went back to the forest and sustained a lifelong connection to the sea.
Ça, c'est des histoires qui ont passées dans la forêt, une passe dans le carreau, une passe dans le bois. La mer, qui ça veut dire pour eux? La mer, pas non, rien. Pas peur la mer. Pas peur la mer, mais seulement ceux qui manger dans la mer, bigo, non, tout la mer, oui. C'est pas tu perds la mer, c'est tu nager, à pixeuse, puis courir, puis tout. Dans Brison, tout ça. Madame, tu as la pêche dans Brison. Pêcher tout. Mais la mer là, pas perdre ça la mer là, pas perdre ça grand la mer là.
Mais les gens nous sortent ici, nous sortent là, nous allons l'osir, dernier zile, qui nous allons pour loin, Astro. Pour nous, 7 jours.
Pour arriver là-bas?
Arrive là-bas, oui. Mais nous l'emmènons, parce que ça a une arrêté, nous la pêche, nous mangeons, la marchandise, les-mêmes, on va payer là-même.
Combien de monde sur le bateau qui est allé 7 jours là?
On vient de 3 dimanches,
de 3? Plusieurs îles, ouais.
Plusieurs îles, c'est pas ça qui garde à eau, ça qui garde parfois,
ouais. Te manque la pêche? Ça te manquait la pêche?
On manquait, oui.
Par l'eau à la mer là, grand la mer là. Ouais.
Moi, avec mon monsieur, qu'un autre madame, nous allons la pêche à soir.
Tu as la pêche à soir?
D'accord, oui. D'accord, de aller.
Ah, c'est pas payé ça grand la mer là?
Tortue.
Oui, longtemps, ouais. Partie des fans, ouais.
Des mois, mon monsieur, qu'un autre madame, nous allons moi, les calimons. Bah oui, il y en a un février, nous dit là, puis il y en a son du bois derrière, il y en a son la nuit. Oui, ça la nuit, on a le ça. Ça la con. Bon, ça la con, le de 10 bois. Les gens là, les rois, ça, animaux que venir là. On voit lit, les piques là, ça bâton sorti.
Bâton ici dans l'homme.
Bâton sorti, tombe là même là pas loin, on va sous bâton, par exemple là, on va dire ça la nuit, après on a la nuit. On va partir à cause de les hôtels, oui, les hôtels parlés, de santé, c'est pas des avions, c'est pas.
Ça donne du bout pour nous. Vous connaissez un chanson là? Vous pas connaître ça, chanson là? Allez, get nous, pas get l'autre côté, get nous tout ensemble.
Mon papa, petit.
Ça colle le encore bien pour le cigare, il là,
Petit, les sociales, alvaré. C'est pas dit, là il vient là-bas, moi là-bas, il a piqué, il fait dans ça. Mais ça sort Jenny, santé là. Oui. Qui m'a dit un cololo, n'a piqué, n'a salué, il a dit un cololo, n'a piqué, un cololo, n'a piqué.
Qui plus gros poisson déjà gagné temps aller?
Forward a little bit.
Research in the Seychelles also included interviews with 2 singers, Patrick Victor and Jenny Letodi. Both shed more light on the ways in which the Seychellois have and are responding to a traumatic slave and colonial past. Music, they indicated, has been critical in this regard. Patrick Victor notes the importance of drumming and the fact of being in the forest as necessary for a transcendental or spiritual experience that allows the Creole person to overcome the pain and the trauma of a violent past. He said that when he spoke about his experiences, his friends told him not to worry about these because transcendence is common and important to resilience. Yes, they told him, it happens here all the time.
So, alors mon grand-maman peut sentir ça, hein? Et ça qui est intéressant, c'est que mon grand-maman, le temps, peut faire nous dormir, peut sentir une romance. Si par hasard, mon grand-papa a encore peut jouer son accordéon, il peut danser tout lui. Il peut danser, le temps, il peut causer avec nous. Le temps, il peut causer avec nous. Les enfants, on veut des choses là pour une dormir, là, pour voir qu'ils ont fait demain au matin, pour les il peut danser, lui, hein? Ok. Alors, ça doit de vivre, si vous l'appelez comme ça, même dans nos petits lacs à campagne, dans nos petits cabanes, dans l'air, là-bas, dans l'ensuite. Et mon content, il y a encore là, en tout cas, ça la case un jour, on dit, on peut emmener nous pour aller. Ou pour aller arriver là-bas, c'est un autre monde, une autre atmosphère, du monde, voisin, encore humain et camarade, non? Les mots encore humain, ça c'est bon voisin qui partage les légumes, partage fruits, les bananes, les maillots, les patates, partage poisson, ok? Partage de l'huile, partage du sel, des oignons, et la tête des oignons. Par exemple, il réalise pour descendre par le magasin, il loin par le bord en mer là-bas, non? Yes. La cétoile, tu viens souvent, la cétoile, à cause de la cétoile, c'est fort le bon affaire. Alors, embli, mon petit panier, au soutien là, la fin du moment, j'ai gagné, j'ai perdu. Quand même, par contre, parole là, il y en a ni ça qui tombe au haut, qui met tout là-dedans, comme si c'était ça l'état là. Hein? Dans un certain moment, Poglo, descendez au Poglo, il y a un petit île appelé Lilette, ou Mars, dans de l'eau salée, ou arrive là-bas. Ben, on finissait en smoothie à jour, d'autres assiser là. Mon prend un tambour, mon fait. Dans une action. Bon, on peut écouter ça, on peut causer en même temps. On peut faire ça. Alors, qui est arrivé, c'est qu'il m'a est aussi un mani, mon content faire ça. C'est temps réalisé pour dire mon père écoute ça, c'est mon parent qui peut faire, pas mon main qui peut taper. Mon père, mon pareil, mon père écouter, mon père enjoy ça, mon père apprécier ça, on transporter, on a de sa son, on vient sa son, pas ou sa son.
Jenny Letourdi, for her part, explained how Leo Cri, the cry of the soul that emerges in the Mutia music, is important to resilience. Letourdi tells us that it is in voicing the resonance of the voice in the forest or at the sea that people are able to express the cry of the soul and therefore build the necessary resilience to deal with current traumatic events.
Okay, so then she tells the story, so it's a bit long. I'll just
Ça commande dans son sol, son triangle, après un dimanche faisait son guitare, après un violon, après sa grosse caisse. Ça c'est nous comme tolé. Yes.
There is also need, as the research indicates, for a balanced approach to environmental and tourism management. Islands are not just locations of leisure. They are places of memory, identity, history, and heritage. Memory and memory making is equally critical to resilience. In the Seychelles, the octopus queen and other inhabitants draw on mesmerizing, sublime memories of the past to enrich their present lives. These memories emerge in food, in stories of fishing and of catching octopus, in remembrances of walking through forests and swimming in waterfalls. Stories of pain are discussed, but are often minimized. This does not mean that stories and trauma disappear, but they are better dealt with And these are lessons that we can learn as we deal with the challenges of climate change.
Levé beau matin, encore un nouveau jour, un rayon soleil qui dit nous bonjour, pas besoin de casser, sans même sa message, laisse-les remplir nos escales noires levées, tu l'envoies aller, tu l'envoies aller. Tu l'envoies aller, it m'a cambo derrière. Tu l'envoies aller, tu l'envoies aller, tu l'envoies aller, il quitte ma cambo derrière.
Merci Jenny, c'était super.
Thank you all for amazing talks. My question is specifically for Dr. Boswell. You studied resilience, psychosocial resilience in the Seychelles, and your video and your talk sort of hinted at this question, at the answer to this question, sorry. But I was wondering if you examined the intersection between indigenous knowledge systems, cultural heritage management, and psychosocial resilience to climate change in any way at all. I saw you address that a little bit in your talk, but I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Okay, we'll maybe take 3 questions and then allow the panelists some time to respond. Yes.
I have a question for Hatib, which is just whether the ideas about invasiveness have changed at all in terms of how these fish are looked at, or is the sort of utility imperative kind of overturning that category? So that's a question for Hatib. And for Philip, you said that there's a parallel in terms of the Asian elephants' environmental history, but I just wanted to hear what human, conflict with humans actually did in that landscape, because you're looking at environment and elephant interactions, but where are the humans and the human-wildlife conflict angles? Where do they appear in your story? Thank you.
My question is to Rose. Obviously, you have such an enviable set of producing your work as an anthropologist, as a poet, as a documentary filmmaker. I think my question is, can you tell us a bit more about the capacities, the potentials of sensory ethnography in thinking about questions of climate change and the community resiliences and resistances toward that? And maybe in relation to that, you mentioned that there is an academic text that precedes the film. I wonder, just for as a thought experiment, what if we would think about, and maybe this is we can do that for those of us who haven't read the book, like if the film precedes the academic text. In other words, right, like film and other forms of representation, they do certain specific, unique, singular things. So maybe if you can talk about the process of the documentary filmmaking as well.
Thank you for the questions. I think, let me start with the first one. Certainly, in the Southern African fieldwork that we have been doing, the intersection between the ethnography and cultural heritage management processes, I think, is more explicit in the sense that we have already published a paper on the national legislation for heritage management in South Africa and the potential gaps in knowledge, in that legislation, and what the ethnography is telling us about ICH in particular, intangible cultural heritage in South Africa's coastal contexts. So there we're already seeing, I think, a practical linkage of the ethnography to formal heritage management processes. We are also seeing, quite interestingly, I think, the linkage between ethnography and corporate social investment. In the sense that in Kenya, in the fieldwork that we're doing in Kenya, I was really interested to see so many people talking about mangrove rehabilitation and the possibilities of that. Because in Lamu, we were quite interested in the linkages between mangrove rehabilitation and honey production. And we did a whole film on honey in Lamu, Kenya. And women's involvement in that process, and the fact that it has like deep religious connotation as work. Honey's work is women's work in the largely Islamic community of Lamu. And so there we are trying to raise funding for the small business development of honey producers in Lamu, Kenya. So I think there are many different linkages, some of it directly back to cultural heritage policy, and other linkages back to the private sector through to corporate social investment and the development of the economy and some of the communities that we've come across. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the question regarding with the word of invasive species. Here in our written versions of the paper, as also you can see in the title of the paper that I presented, is that are these introduced fish or invasive species in West Papua? So basically, Anna Sings and I argue that they are co-invasive, not only invasive, but co-invasive. What we meant by this is that co-invasive means non-human companion in settler occupations. So the word co-invasive that we use is to go against the grains of much recent work in the environmental humanities, which has declared war on the terms of the invasive species by arguing that the term of invasive species is xenophobic and often racist. Like if you read the recent book from Shinozuka, for example, Biotic Border, or Jessica Catalino, who's working on the indigenous people in indigenous Native American in the US. And so most of this analysis to us still stays on the level of discourse and rhetoric. So we think that only few of the authors follow the introduced organism into the landscape and ecologists to see their effect, like what we did in West Papua. So the omissions of doing research is possible because almost all of this analysis consider that human and non-human as entirely separated in their actions. So we use the co-invasive species, seeing that human and non-human is not separated in their actions, but they're kind of like entangled. In other words, we argue that human and non-human invasions in our concept of co-invasive means that needed to be understood together. Non-human introduction that get out of hand are almost always element of human invasions, that how they gain the force of the proliferations. So our concept co-species invasive should be an object of analysis. I think human and non-human co-species invasions is, I think, is certainly relevant to the to study of the introduction of freshwater fish in Papua, and then how fish introductions by human help them to make the landscape available for the settlers' occupation, basically. So the transformations of so basically by using the co-invasive species, we can do the analysis of the transformation of the landscape into the destruction of the swampland and the sago groves, which made earlier livelihood of the settlers to be possible, and then continuing the introduce species and alter hydrology in West Papua, and also allowing the introduced species to be invasive. That was because of the settlers entanglement or settler intervention in that case. So I think by using this co-species invasive as a concept, I think could be kind of like new novelty approach that we are trying to do in seeing how this to be co-invasive in the new landscape or in the new frontier landscape in West Papua.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. In fact, it speaks to actually what I've written down in the first part of the written up version of this paper, which I didn't present today, about the nature of conflict and the nature of human-elephant interactions and their relationship overall in 19th century Nyamwezi. One of the things I want to do, though, is actually not just emphasize conflict. Elephants in Nyamwezi, as in many other cultures, were highly symbolic animals. Similar to several other cultures, they represented political authority. And this is something that comes through in Troutman's work on the Asian elephant, but it also comes through in lots of anthropological studies focusing on elephants in Africa, notably Ross's massive kind of table, what was his edited volume, which is kind of like a museum exhibit in an edited volume, which was published in the 1990s, which focuses mostly on Western Africa. And Nyamwezi Eastern Africa is kind of missing from the case studies there. But again, kind of the emphasis is on the idea that elephants represented political authority. Now, in Nyamwezi, in the 19th century, this comes through in the sources, but also comes through kind of human-elephant interaction, and how humans interpreted elephants and used their products. Political leaders claimed one tusk of any elephant who died or was killed in their territory, for example. So it's considered kind of their right as a political leader to one tusk. They also were sometimes responsible for distributing a portion of the elephant meat for consumption, although sometimes it's available as a marketable commodity too. Hunters, specialized hunters, also wore elephant products because it's kind of a symbol of their profession. Ivory discs and bracelets, and elephant hair or cartilage, which kind of bracelets were made from elephant hair or cartilage, and so it's a symbol of their profession. Elephant products also used in medicine and they had spiritual applications. But I should stress that as the 19th century wore on and the ivory trade became more lucrative, some political leaders, notably Mirambo, attempted to declare a monopoly on all ivory passing through their domains, and reinterpreted as a commodity for export. Ivory became kind of less prevalent in everyday fashions over time. Humans also interact with elephants in kind of more mundane ways outside of these kind of symbolic elements. And symbolic and commercial elements. Elephants are often viewed as a pest. A herd of elephants walking through a cultivated area could eat produce and destroy planted fields, for example. Nyamwezi farmers attempted to protect against these ravages by building fences and digging disguised pitfalls around their settlements. But according to the sources, the early imperial sources, neither strategy is fail-safe. Elephants regularly push down fences, and the pitfalls are a danger to other fauna, including domestic livestock. But there are also symbiotic elements to the relationship too. Elephants regularly cleared tracks through forests, which traders and fugitives followed, especially in zones distant from regularly used trade routes. Also, elephants' sheer size helped humans to protect against the effects of drought. They churned up ground, leaving holes, which humans dug further to find water. And Nyamwezi folkloric stories collected by a German colonial administrator also point to wild animals' roles in digging for water, and to an elephant being the king in this context. So again, referring to this kind of sees kind of the symbiotic relationship, but also pointing to the representation of political power here as well. But obviously, hunting was probably the main aspect of the conflictual relationship. And this kind of level of conflict and the scale of the conflict grew during the 19th century. In the early and mid-19th century, elephant hunting was mostly conducted by specialized hunters who used a combination of spears, pitfalls, bows, and arrows. And this is throughout Eastern Africa. In Nyamwezi, the most common form appears to have been using spears, although all are mentioned at different points. But as the expansion of the global ivory trade the global ivory trade expanded, hunting became more pervasive. And kind of became a more general activity, most notably because of the circulation of firearms, of guns, mostly flintlock muskets. These were imports into Eastern Africa during the 19th century in exchange for ivory. And then political leaders, most notably Mirambo again, distributed muskets to his army, which were young men, not specialized hunters, and they used these muskets both for expanding Mirambo's domain, for exacting tribute, and for hunting ivory. So it becomes less a specialized pursuit; it becomes more very much an economic and political pursuit. Over time, so kind of the conflict with elephants, becomes much more pervasive and much more general, rather than kind of a specialized one in terms of hunting. I think that's pretty much that covers my response there.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining. My question is for everybody. What's next for you in terms of this project and with the theme of intertwined ecologies?
Thank you very much for the presentation. Professor Lewis, thank you very much for the film. And I saw there that the psycho-social that you are considering, and the element that you covered is music, dance, and somewhere I saw food, but usually these communities, when they do dancing, they do eating, they also drink. So my question is drinking not part of the strategy they use to deal with the kind of, the challenge that they experience, the climate change challenge? So drink and probably smoking, do they also use that, or this is not happening in that community? Thank you.
Okay, and I think I saw one more hand here, and then we'll throw it back to the panelists. I'm sorry, did you have your hand up? Never mind, false hand. I do that to students all the time. They don't like it either. But yeah, so we have those couple of questions, and then we can go ahead and wrap up from there.
So can I, because there was a question from the previous round that I didn't answer. So I think I'll just tackle it quickly all together. So the sensory ethnography aspect is actually the core frame that we're using for the study. Well, it's a major frame that we're using in the study, because our findings very clearly show that the impacts of climate change and even other forms of change in the coastal context are often very visceral impacts, in the sense of being, in the South African context, people being forcibly removed, for example, from the coast to make way for real estate development in coastal South Africa, especially along what is known as the South Cape coast. And then the experiences, as you saw from the film, the auditory aspect, the role of music, the role of sound, the role of particular kinds of atmosphere, which is relayed in the chapter in the book, around the feeling of the enveloping forest, the forest that is all-encompassing, the nurturing forest, and the darkness of the forest, compared to the brightness of the lagoon and the ocean and the feeling of buoyancy, on the water. So all of these are elements which are which excuse the pun, which surface in the book, and are analyzed for their particular contributions to our understandings of the impacts of climate change. And then insofar as the process of producing the films is concerned, I said that it precedes it, but there are 5 chapters in the book dealing with different case studies from Namibia through to Seychelles. And I'm almost finished with the book. So what is happening and what has happened actually is that the production process has been a contemporaneous one rather than one, the one necessarily preceding the other. And we found that with the film, the constraints are that you've got a certain amount of time and you cannot articulate everything, and that you hope in some way that the imagery, the sound, the manner of the body positioning of the participants, that all of these elements will contribute to the audience understanding what these individuals are going through. But remember, this is not a scripted film. So there isn't any form of acting that is actually, what you see is the natural outcome of the conversations that we were having with these participants. So it has been quite a complex process because, we are not originally documentary filmmakers, but we saw the potential in the recording of the many interviews that we did, that these really did have, qualities just beyond the interview process that we could then potentially use for filmmaking. And so then we were compelled, not in the Seychelles case because it's very expensive to go back to the Seychelles, but for places like Namibia and Kenya and so on, we went back several times over to collect additional footage that we didn't have when we started out with the plans for the film. And then, so that's the short answer to that long question. And the poetry part is part of that process, because I always say the poetry it's a device. It's like the key to the puzzle for the ethnography, because you can instantly almost compose a poem that encapsulates what it is that you've seen and experienced and felt. And fortunately, it is not subject to double-blind peer review. So you don't have to change your poem to suit the reviewer, and you can go back to it, and if you read the poem, it'll give you the feeling of what it was like to be in that space. So I've used the poems in that way, and a lot of the poems in Love O'Brien are very much around those instantaneous emotional feelings. So in a way, taking the ethnography, the sensory ethnography, transmuting it into poetry. So those are some of the things that I've been playing around with. And just to answer the question at the back there, yes, drink that's in the ethnographic discussion. The Seychelles has a very, very long history of indigenous brewing of various kinds, from plants, from cocoa palms. They have a thriving rum industry, but it has been both good and bad, in the sense that where you look at indigenous alcohol consumption, for example, that happens in courtyards, that is managed by families and communities, that is something that is a little bit more supportive. And then you've had the use of like in South Africa, you've had the use of alcohol in the sort of plantation setting. So there is a very, very rich history of drinks of various kinds. And the music, and of course you had a glimpse of that, of the parties that go with it. So the celebrations, either at home or in the forest, is a very important way of actually coping with the embodied impacts of change in the environment and society. Yeah, so on. Sorry.
Right. Next project, for the questions about next project, what we should be done after this on the issue of intertwined ecology, is that the first one, I think we are going to from this event panel, we're going to explore more about the trade networks that allow the introductions of the fish in the Indian Oceans to from Indian Ocean, or even from the history from the mainland in Africa, which we speculate or we assume that could be from the free trade networks or from non-state interventions exchange back in 18th or 19th century, but then when it proliferated in, for example, in Southeast Asia or in Indonesia, and then the species then turned to be very highly an object to, under the specific research on the fisheries development and agriculture development, and even under the military interventions. How this kind of fish that is the first time coming from the free trade or coming from the, like aquatic exchange in the under the ocean, Indian water, then becomes to be under a very highly scientific and military intervention in when it turns to in Indonesia. That's the first project that we hope we can cover those issues. And then the second one is that our project is going to see how this kind of fish, multi-species fish, and then turn to be a kind of food security in Indonesia because of their ability to proliferate into thousands of the fry, and then it becomes a food security project for Indonesian government, for example, and then they proliferate the program under the so-called food security, which basically this is a kind of program which, if we see in the global politics, is totally under the encouragement of the World Bank or IMF, for example, by putting or operating all of this food security in the place where it seems as an empty or void, like West Papua, for example. That's a point two that are going to be our project, to see how these fish that tend to be invasive are used as a tool for the Indonesian government for the food security in West Papua. I think that's going to be our second approach as well. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So this paper comes kind of from a broader project focusing on the environmental history of equatorial Eastern Africa between the years about 1750 and 1890, although this one goes a little bit further than kind of what I've been focusing on for the most part. And kind of the project itself focuses on the major state building zones. So Unyamwezi being one of them, and the other one being Buganda, in present-day Uganda, centered on in present-day Kampala. And the overall project is to kind of look at all the aspects of environmental history as I possibly can, incorporate it into kind of a more holistic project. This paper obviously took kind of a multi-species perspective to environmental change. The original idea for the project was actually more of a climate history and historical climatology. I recently worked with some climatologists at the University of Sussex to make a climate reconstruction of 3 locations in Tanzania, and we used kind of a mixture of documentary sources and climate models. So that's kind of a historical climatology using a kind of an interdisciplinary approach. Other aspects of the project have looked at kind of trying to analyze how variable climatic conditions kind of affected the region's history. This is a kind of response to current challenges in global warming. Like, if the future of humanity is to be indelibly shaped by how it responds to the challenge of global warming, kind of the broader questions that climate historians ask is how has variable climatic conditions affected the past human societies as well. There's been a lot of work on the Little Ice Age in that context. I'm kind of taking this from the end of the Little Ice Age to the beginning of European colonialism, or in terms from a climate historian's perspective, what Mike Davis referred to kind of the late period of the late Victorian Holocausts. Of course, Davis didn't refer to much to Africa in his book, but I think there's some linkages with the Eastern African case studies there as well. Also, I've kind of in another paper which is currently under review, so I hope none of you are reviewing it. there's kind of trying to take a GIS approach to environmental change as well. So I'm trying to, so in terms of what is happening, what this paper represents and what's coming next, it's kind of, it's the environmental, trying to focus on kind of an environmental history of Eastern Africa from, the end of from the end of the Little Ice Age to the beginning of European colonialism. And just kind of taking as many perspectives and approaches to kind of that, to environmental history as I possibly can. And then maybe see if that turns into a book of some kind down the road. But yeah, that's what's happening and what will be coming out soon.
At one point, one last point, I forget to add. Sorry. The third point that I want to add is that about to explore more about the not only non-human and non-human relations, but also how these non-human and non-human relations entangle to the landscape, which so far it's need to be added in seeing the multi-species approach, where it's not only about the human non-human relations, but also how this kind of non-human and human relations also change or affect if the landscape is different, for example. That's why we're going to see how fish that basically coming from the Indian Ocean water, for example, from the Africa, and then it's mutate or changed when it encounter with the kind of like new landscape in, like, for example, in West Papua. So to conclude, I'm going to see how putting like anything as well, like putting like human and non-human relations which entangle to the landscape, and also urban infrastructure or human modifications, which basically it's create the nature or the traits of the species itself when they encounter with the new landscape. Thank you.